Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 35 of the Bible and Science. We've been dealing with a number of things at the microscopic level that DNA is responsible for, and we've also touched on a few things at the macroscopic, the visible level, that are the results of DNA. We're going to do one more episode on that and then move on toward the fossil record. I was blown away when I first heard about these. There's a group of fish in Hawaii called the climbing gobies, Sissiopteris stimsoni. Yeah, I hope you can pronounce it better than I can. But there's a little fish called a goby that lives in Hawaii. It hatches in fresh water, and then the current sweeps it out to sea. It's able to change its body's response to the salinity of the sea, and it does just fine out there. And then when it's time for it to breed, to reproduce, it swims back up a freshwater stream. So far, so good. Sounds like the salmon. Yes, but what it does then is climb a 400-foot waterfall to lay or to fertilize the eggs. How does it do that? Well, it has a suction cup mouth. It also has a suction cup on its belly. So it sucks on the damp rocks with its mouth, wriggles a little bit, grabs hold with the abdomen, straightens out, does it again, does it again, does it again. It's able to climb a 400-foot high waterfall by using the suction cup in conjunction with a separate sucker in its abdomen. It gradually wriggles up about as high as a 40-story building. Now, could you run a vertical marathon race using only your mouth and a suction cup attached to your belly? That's the equivalent of what this fish does based on its small size. Well, I don't think this is an accident. I think it would be really, really, really difficult for the parts to come together. Remember, one of the best arguments for design is an extremely low probability of a bunch of steps. There's an extremely low probability of a bunch of steps necessary to produce this mechanism that you find in the Hawaiian climbing goby. There's a little type of beetle that lives in my neck of the woods in South Louisiana, and I'm sure it's elsewhere also. It's commonly called the bombardier beetle. It's Brachinus chernicky. This little guy has got an amazing defense mechanism. In its internal part, it's got storage chambers where its body produces hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone, which when mixed together have the potential to react violently, but they won't until you add a couple of enzymes to them. So the beetle is able to produce the two chemical components that are going to react, plus it also has got the ability to produce the two activating enzymes, catalase and peroxidase. Remember, just about anything that ends in ASE is an enzyme. So the beetle has got the ability to manufacture and store this, and then also to manufacture and inject the activating enzymes so that it can blast out. Its rear end has got a couple of little swivel turrets, like little gun barrels, that can swivel 360 degrees. It can even shoot over its back and down under its belly and off to the sides. Anytime it's threatened, it injects the activating enzymes, the catalase and peroxidase, and what's stored on the inside of it will then react violently, and it blasts out a boiling hot liquid that stinks. So if you're a frog and you want to eat one of these guys and you see it there and you say, oh yeah, let me stick my tongue out, it's hilarious. If you see what happens, the beetle blasts whatever it is it's trying to eat it, and the predator quickly loses interest. So the first time I ever saw this happen, I just laughed at it. I don't have any videos, but I'm sure you can find them. I don't have the rights to publish videos. But there's a picture of a bombardier beetle up there from Wikimedia, and I'm thankful to Wikimedia and the people that are involved with that for all of the things that they've produced. So this system is programmed into the beetle's DNA. Now let's think about how it might have gradually evolved. So here are the ancestors of the beetle, and they develop all these chemicals on the inside, and they inject the activating enzymes, and they explode. They've got to have a mechanism to release those. So they aim their little gun barrels at whatever their target is. And if you know anything about Newton's third law of motion, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, if the beetle blasts this out of its rear end, it's going to propel it forward. But if you ever watch a high-speed video of what the beetle does, it blasts, pauses, blasts, pauses, blasts, pauses in a tiny, tiny fraction of a second, milliseconds. So it blasts, braces its feet, shoot, brace, shoot, brace, shoot, brace, shoot, brace. So it shoots many, many, many of these at a clip, and it allows the beetle to stay in place, and whatever was after it says, no, I'm not going to go try to eat that beetle anymore. So even if all of the parts were present, if any one of them does not work right, the ancestor of the bombardier beetle might have exploded. You could make up a story about how that mechanism could evolve one step at a time, but I wouldn't believe you. Would you believe if I made up a story? I think all of the parts have to be there at the same time. This is irreducible complexity, which is to me the best argument for design. Then there's another phenomenon that you see throughout nature called bioluminescence, where living things produce light. There are many organisms that are able to produce light through internal chemical reactions. They all use a light-emitting molecule called a luciferin that has to do with the bearer of light. It's from the Latin, and there has to be an activating enzyme called the luciferase. But the exact composition of these chemicals varies from one species to another. There are at least 4 factors needed in order for an organism to be bioluminescent. Number 1, it's got to be able to produce the luciferin, the thing that's going to glow. Then it's got to be able to produce a luciferase that works with that, the activating enzyme. Then it's got to be able to store those 2 things until they're needed. And then it has to be able to mix those chemicals at a precisely controlled rate in order to obtain the correct reaction. There are also many species that can produce elaborate moving patterns, and I want to refer you to something on your TV. Go to tedtalks.com. David Gallo has a really neat thing. He didn't do the work himself, but he shows what happens with cuttlefish and octopuses and things like that. They can do amazing moving patterns, and they can look like just about anything they need to look like. Why are these mechanisms there? Because they're programmed into the DNA. If any part is missing, the whole system is a useless waste of resources, and it would be eliminated, not encouraged by natural selection, because it's wasting resources. This is not just 1 or 2 things in nature. Bioluminescent organisms include fungi, algae, bacteria, protists, vertebrates, invertebrates. Most of these are not considered to be closely related. So evolutionists have to believe that this mechanism, this ability, evolved many times independently in at least 3 separate kingdoms of the biological world. How improbable would it be for random mutations to produce this phenomenon of bioluminescence in the DNA of even one species? But I went to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and they said that bioluminescence must have evolved separately and independently over 100 times. Okay, you talk about extreme improbability. If your mind is made up that there could not possibly be a God, okay, there's nothing I could say to persuade you. But looking at this is marks of intelligence all over the place. So if you want to believe that this is an accident, you're going to have to ignore the laws of probability to maintain your faith in naturalism. There's some examples of comb jelly, fungus, luminous fish, lanternfish, belly lantern sharks, independent invertebrates, many things, at least 100 times in nature, in at least 3 separate kingdoms. Why would bioluminescence evolve? Or why is a rose a rose? Why is a bug a bug? And so forth. The structures in every living thing are determined by the information in its DNA. Mutations, that is, accidental copying mistakes, have to occur in order for DNA to change. So the chemicals needed for bioluminescence, as I said, a luciferin and a luciferase, each type of thing has a different formula for its luciferin and its luciferase. Many different formulas in the species that have this ability. That means the DNA is going to have to evolve mechanisms that are different, yet produce the same end result 100 separate times. All of this by random chance. Earlier, we dealt with the fact that there are elaborate error-correcting mechanisms that serve to prevent evolution, not encourage it. Well, what's going on here? You can either believe that the error-preventing mechanisms were overridden many thousands of times by random chance, or maybe God really wanted to have evolution occur. You can believe that and accidentally got similar results, or you could believe, as I do, it's reasonable that bioluminescence is the result of design. Which one makes more sense? A bunch of random accidents or design? Remember, I've talked about this before, arguments for design. I don't care about your opinion, but if there's extreme improbability in a specific pattern, like the example of a groundhog or an armadillo trying to make it across a busy 1,000-lane superhighway, well, there's no theoretical barrier that says it can't happen. You would just recognize it's reasonable. Nah, that wouldn't happen. Okay, then the other really good argument is irreducible complexity, but that's not the case here. This is extreme improbability for this to happen just by random chance mutations in the DNA of 100 separate types of living things. Here's a few more that we'll get to before we start talking about the fossil record next time. Camouflage. There are many animals like stonefish, walking sticks, leaf hoppers, and so forth. They blend in with their surroundings because they look like the surroundings. Why do they look like the surroundings? Not because they need camouflage, but because the camouflage mechanism is programmed into their DNA. You know, it's hard enough to explain when they look like an inanimate object like a rock, but it's even harder when many of them look like surrounding plants whose features are also determined by their DNA. So either the plant DNA and the animal DNA just happened to evolve independently and fit together, or else they were designed that way. Well, you have to decide, is this more likely an accident, or is it more likely that there's some sort of design in nature? I can't prove that there's design. You could always say, well, I just don't believe that. Yeah, okay, but is it reasonable? The most reasonable thing to me is that there's intelligence involved here. And this is going to be some of my favorite things, the octopus. I don't have the rights to videos. These are on Wikimedia Commons and Pixabay. The capability of octopuses and cuttlefish to camouflage themselves, to disguise themselves, and so forth is astonishing. So I strongly recommend you go to your local PBS station or pbs.org online and do a search for octopus, and you'll see some of these things. An octopus can make it look like its surroundings. It can look like rocks. It can look like a snake, as you see there, a bunch of snakes. It can get through tiny, tiny, tiny openings, and it also can produce elaborate patterns that make it look like other organisms or like a rock or something like that. So go look up octopus on PBS and just do a search. Octopuses are so different from everything else that some have even half-jokingly suggested they must have come from another planet. There was a sci-fi comedy, it was called Resident Alien, and that was one of the things they kept hammering on, that the octopus must have come from outer space because they're so different from everything else. And what is your blood based on? Iron. Well, some of these cephalopods have blood that's based on copper. How's that going to evolve? Just a few more things. There's a process called symbiosis where two things have a mutually beneficial relationship. One of them has to do with cleaning of things like alligators and crocodiles and so forth. There are certain species of small birds, fish, and shrimp. They will walk or swim up to certain vicious predators like crocodiles, sharks, barracudas. And so you say, oh, this animal is crazy, it's going to get eaten. No, the predator opens its mouth, allows them to enter, pick off the debris, the parasites, and so forth, and leave safely. Any other species that walks into the mouth of the crocodile or the shark or the barracuda gets eaten, but not these little cleaners. For some reason, the predators decide, I will let this thing walk into my mouth and I will not eat it. So if that behavior is a result of mutations, then there must have been multiple species of cleaners that acquired mutations to make them want to walk into a predator's mouth, or swim into a predator's mouth. At the same time, fortunately, the predator acquired mutations that made it decide not to eat the cleaners. If you want to believe that's an accident, there's nothing I can do to persuade you otherwise, but I think it's pretty plain this is the result of design. Otherwise, it's incredibly good luck for the cleaners that the predator's mutations happened at exactly the same time. You might have seen Nemo, Finding Nemo. Okay, there's a type of fish called the clownfish that swims around sea anemones. And the anemones are deadly. They have stingers that will paralyze or kill things, but they don't sting the clownfish. Why? It's not that the clownfish are immune. The clownfish feed the anemones. They swim in between the tentacles. An anemone is an animal, but it can't move. So the clownfish swim in between the tentacles, and they bring little bits of food, and they feed the anemone, and in return, the anemone protects them from attack by other things. The sharks are not going to swim in there after them because it wouldn't feel very good for the shark to get stung by these things. So is this an accident symbiosis where these things just kind of get together on their own, or is it more likely design? I keep saying, is it more likely, because that's what it comes down to. You have to make a decision what seems more reasonable to you. Okay, most migratory birds fly over land, but there are several that travel thousands of miles over open ocean with no landmarks. If their navigation were off by a tenth of a degree, they would fall into the ocean, they would become exhausted, fall into the ocean and drown. Now, birds are supposed to have first evolved over 225 million years ago. So whatever method they use to navigate would also have to be hundreds of millions of years old. Well, I don't believe it's that old myself, but if you do, their method of navigation would also be hundreds of millions of years old. Well, okay, why is it that the birds can navigate the continents? Evolutionists believe the continents and ocean islands were arranged very much differently just 100 million years ago, not 225 million, just 100 million. So until the bird's migratory mechanism, migratory sense evolved to match the moving continents, they would have fallen into the ocean and drowned. What do? We make up stories. What do you need facts for when you can make up stories? This is what Darwin said. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, he said, to suppose that that could be an accident, I freely confess it seems absurd in the highest degree. Was he giving up? No, he made up a story. He said, reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist, each grade being useful to its possessor, as is certain the case, if further the eye ever varies and the variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, while he goes on to say, well, this has to be true. The difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection should not be considered as subversive of the theory. So what he's saying was, I'm going to make up a story, and because I'm so smart, you have to believe my story. I don't believe that story. The eye is programmed to form in a certain way. It's not something that gradually accumulated by a little bitty bit of change at a time. So if you look at the inner workings of the eye, the retina is a multi-megapixel receiver, 10 million times better able to deal with changing light conditions than our best cameras. So there's a diagram, that's a clip art diagram of some of the things going on in the eye, and it's actually much more complex than that. But before the eye converts the light to an electrical signal and sends it down the optic nerve to the brain, each nerve cell does a tremendous amount of pre-processing. It's been estimated it would take even the fastest computers months, Cray supercomputer, would take months to process the visual information that comes into your eye every second continually. And remember, we're working with 6,000 or 7,000 year old technology that God put in the human eye at the very beginning. Some criticize and say the eye is wired backwards. Well, light has to travel through the retina to reach the rods and cones on the backside. Skeptics say this is just random, it's not designed because it would cut down on the light that can get through. Well, that's not true. The components are so small that they're optically transparent. There's practically no loss of light. And if the rods and cones were in front of the retina, as the evolutionists criticize, they might take months to recover from a bright light. But because they're behind it, they're in constant contact with nutrients and are able to continually repair themselves. And guess what the eye uses? Fiber optics. We just invented fiber optics within the last 100 years or so, but the eye uses that since the beginning of the human species. So rather than poor design, the arrangement of the retina, the rods, the cones, and those things shows fantastic engineering. These are just a few examples. They barely scratch the surface of the indications of design and therefore a designer in nature. I think that the designer is the God of the Bible, but you at least have to admit this is something that would not happen by random chance. If a reasonable person thinks logically about these phenomenon, you would have to admit it sure looks like nature is full of design. Those who reject that possibility do so strictly for religious reasons because they don't want to admit there could possibly be a God. They don't have scientific reasons. They have religious reasons. They don't want there to be a God. The last few episodes we've been dealing with indications of design in nature at the microscopic level all the way up to the macroscopic level, the visible level. We could go on and on and on like this for years. There are many that have spent their entire careers on it. But we're going to move on. We've been talking about what does happen right now. This is something that you can talk about science for. You can observe, repeat, and test. But we're going to move on next time to how did things get that way. We'll start talking about the indications from the fossil record about what actually happened in the distant past.